It's really fantastic to be here to celebrate the completion of the case studies in the issues paper, and it's been a really great project, fascinating for me, and it's been particularly interesting and enjoyable working closely with Helen and with Tanya, so thank you very much. So as you know, this project aims to encourage the ongoing exploration of the possibilities for reusing Victoria's industrial heritage. And given this, although I feel like my job is done, we want to use the project really to generate an ongoing discussion. So instead of telling you too much about what we've done, we want to use this as an occasion to push the conversation on, and hence this symposium. And we're really thrilled to have such fantastic guest speakers joining us in this endeavour. So thank you. As you know, the afternoon's split into two sessions. The first panel that we're about to begin looks at new uses and users, and the second at urban possibilities. The sessions are framed as panel discussions, but to get the conversation going, we want to begin with each panellist making a very short presentation, and these presentations will then provide the ground for discussion. We also hope that we'll have some time for questions at the end from the audience, so please do keep this in mind as you're following the discussion. So, the first session, new uses and users. This explores the intersection of industrial heritage and new users from two perspectives. How new uses might reinvigorate former industrial spaces and places and knit them into the life of the contemporary city or other built environments, and I suppose non-built environments. And conversely, what opportunities industrial heritage might offer to new users. And I guess we're also interested in a discussion of appropriate new use. What kinds of uses work best in which context? What are the challenges and pressure points as well as the opportunities? So joining me to discuss this are Helen Lardner, Ellie Giannini, Eleni Arbus and Angus Farquhar. And I'm going to introduce everybody now, I think, instead of as you go, so that I can shut up and everyone else can get going. So Helen is an architect and conservation architect and the director of HLCD, a practice that specialises in providing strategic advice for conservation and adaptive reuse of complex heritage places and undertaking analysis of cultural significance. Helen's particularly interested in industrial sites and 20th century architecture. She was formerly Vice President of the Australian ICOMOS and is currently the National Representative for Tiki in Australia, as well as an experienced heritage advisor to local government. And as you have heard, Helen is a member of the Heritage Council and she instigated and led this project. So thank you, Helen. Ellie Giannini. Ellie is a director of MGS Architects, a practice that has significant experience working with industrial spaces and places. And Ellie's going to talk today, I'll begin today by talking about the Banbury development on the site of the Olympic Tyre Factory, but I'm sure she will have much else to contribute to the discussion as well. Eleni Arbus is the Program Manager of Creative Spaces and led the development of River Studios, which she's going to discuss with us today. Eleni has a background in film production and direction, I just found out, which I think really explains a lot about the transfer of those skills into the use of built environment for supporting artistic endeavour, and I think it's a fantastic program and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it. Angus Farquhar. Angus is with us, joining us from Glasgow, which I think we're very fortunate with. Angus is Creative Director of NVA, which is a Scottish arts-based charity that he started in 1992. NVA's vision is to make powerful public art articulating the complex qualities of location through collective action. One of the NVA's projects is the Invisible College, which is an international learning network that hosts a wide range of events, exhibitions and interventions in response to the buildings, productive landscape and extensive historic grounds of St Peter's Seminary in Glasgow. St Peter's is one of Europe's most significant modernist buildings, which had been deteriorating for 25 years prior to this activity. So St Peter's isn't an industrial site, but I think we're incredibly fortunate to have Angus here, and that we look forward to sort of expanding the conversation that one might have through his involvement. And as you know, this evening Angus is giving a public talk as part of the MSD agenda series. So we're going to begin with Helen, and Helen may go over her allocated 5 minutes because she has a substantial amount to talk about with the case studies. So, but everyone else is going to be short and sharp.
Okay.
Oh yes, we can.
Okay, come on, that's good. Hello everybody, I know quite a few of you in the audience, and I'm really pleased to see that people have come along to this launch. As Justine just said, she gave me 2 tasks. She said, I just want to get you to give an overview of all the issues that arose in the issues paper, and how about 5 minutes? And I said, well, one or the other. So I'll try and be quick, and I won't actually be explaining much about the case studies themselves. I have tried to use them to illustrate some of the issues, and I won't be properly acknowledging the architects or the photographers or anybody like that, but my excuse is I'm encouraging you to look at them online and look at all those details for yourself. So my apologies for that. Thank you to Ginny and Jim. I wanted to just add my small thanks, particularly to Justine and Tanya, who have both worked incredibly hard on this project. So when we were starting to think about the project, we were considering that it was very timely in Victoria to discuss industry, and we're hearing every day about, you know, the death of manufacturing, the car industry, the potential for projects, Fisherman's Bend, the Amcor paper mill now at Alphington. I think there's a lot of interest about industrial sites becoming redundant and what the opportunities are. And one of the things we sat down to do, first of all, was to look at case studies. And a key question arose for us, which we haven't really been able to answer, but I hope that we might have some conversation about this. We thought about the fact that Victoria was really the centre of 19th century manufacturing in Australia. Victoria retains a good stock of industrial heritage places, and we've got excellent architects here. We've got excellent heritage people here. We've got a good, really good, sound statutory system. But even so, we struggled to find many Victorian examples that had been done in recent times that were particularly exciting. And we started to look further afield, and you'll notice that quite a few of our examples come from interstate. Now, we didn't get to the bottom of why this is the case, but I suppose the overarching goal for this project was aiming for the case studies to be inspiring, so that over the next few years we might look back on the work that's being done in Victoria and be suitably impressed. So I've just put this one up with a little play on users and users. Of course, we are talking about people and change in industry. Along the bottom is the huge crowd of workers at the Hoffman Brickworks in Brunswick. And up the top, you'll be pleased to know, is my own dad. There he is, working at the Age office, producing the Age. And I just put that up as an example of the way industry has changed. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk to a little bit about is the distinctiveness of place, which I think is particularly evident in industrial places. So we have with industry real connections to whole precincts and whole communities, and even linear connections through transport systems to other places, to ports, to railways, to centres. So when we're talking about industrial places, we're talking about a lot more than just buildings. I think when we had the workshop, I used the term flow, and I do like to think about our industrial places in terms of flows. I think of the materials flowing in and the products flowing out. I think of the workers flowing in and then the workers flowing out. And I think of the flow between the site and the surroundings, reaching out to the community, and through those connections I've mentioned, as well as the ebbs and flows in the economy. I think it's really interesting in these times to think about what Australia can produce and the effect of the economy on manufacturing. So I think in this context we're looking at the flow of uses over time for sites that may have had one use or may have had a succession of uses. And what we're talking about really is the legibility of the heritage values in those places, the distinctiveness, the thing that makes the area special. Now, the examples I've put up are sort of industrial types. They could be in other places, but the one up the top is actually from the suburbs fronting the Brisbane River, northeast of the CBD. Many of you might know about the urban regeneration program since 1991 there, which really demonstrates very good ongoing political commitment and community engagement. It's been very successful, and that's one of the case studies. Carriage Works, which is down on the right over there, is another very large-scale successful example. It's from Everleigh in New South Wales, and it was a very run-down public asset, and I know that the work in the program is still continuing, but there's a lot happening there and a lot of successful regeneration there as well. And I look at that and I wonder about Newport Railway Workshops, a site that I've had an involvement with over a long time, although not recently, but I'm hoping we might see some revival there. And the one down on the left, it's a photo I took actually last Sunday at Williamstown, but I'm wondering if it could have been Docklands. Where are those elements that have gone from Docklands? In our successful reuse of heritage places, we're actually, I think, talking about placemaking, which is often about the well-being of the community and creating identity for a community. One of my favourite quotes from Hoffman's, "As long as you could see the Hoffman's chimneys, you wasn't lost." And I think whole suburbs, for example, like Brunswick with the brick and clay making, for a long time, the identification of people in that area was associated with landmarks like chimneys, and the fact that generations of families worked in the same place. And because of the scale of some of our industrial places and that connection to the community, we have the ability, I think, to create that sense of placemaking. I like the fact with the Canberra Glassworks down in the bottom right-hand side, we're missing the chimney there, and it's a beautiful project, I think, an artistic interpretation in glass and light that puts back the chimney as a landmarker for that community. Of course, that was the Kingston power station, the powerhouse, and has been a really highly successful redevelopment as well. But this sort of sense of community and placemaking doesn't have to be large-scale landmarks, doesn't have to be the chimney on the horizon. And I've included the photograph of Fennell Street Fisherman's Bend, the development there, which was the Red Tulip Easter egg factory. And it's been reinvigorated with a strong aesthetic of industry and industrial type uses, and I think it's a really successful collaboration of finding tenants that fit well with the character of the place. And I think we're in a situation where we're yet to see what happens with Fisherman's Bend, but sometimes these small gestures, these new uses, but retaining those sort of character parts of what remains on the site can lead to successful reinvigoration. Now, one of the reasons that successful projects stood out for us was where an appropriate use was matched to the characteristics of the site. And sometimes appropriate uses are very difficult. The former Olympic tyre factory at the top left-hand side, which Ellie's going to talk about and which I worked on with her firm, That is an example of a residential redevelopment, and really we struggled very hard to find industrial places that had successfully been reinvented for residential use. And the reason for that lay particularly in the type of regulations that were faced, particularly the BCA requirements to separate dwellings, and also I think in the expectations, the standard of finishes and things that people wanted. But I put this picture up because these sort of more decorative spaces actually belong to the administration and showroom section of that project. And in fact, it was one where, starting from the Conservation Management Plan, we really identified that there were special spaces that couldn't be broken up, that had to be communal spaces, and that residential had to go elsewhere. The Flour Mills project on the right-hand side in New South Wales was an example where the plan had very small compartments and it limited the type of use, but very successful conversion to strata-titled offices, to small offices. And in both those projects, as well as the complying the contamination issues and the importance of interpretation, where people may end up in a small part of the site, but they need to have some understanding of the site and the values overall. At the bottom is the Bass Coast Rail Trail. I mentioned earlier the linear relationships, which are often very important to industrial places, and I think this is a delightful use of something that is very appropriate not only for the actual trail itself, but also because it allows people to move through the countryside and appreciate aspects of industry and agriculture. And it's an example, like a few of the others, where the development has taken a long time and may go on for a lot longer, but that's a feature of some of these sort of places. These are two examples that I wanted to raise where the place itself can be seen very strongly as interpretation. The Paddington Reservoir Gardens in New South Wales, if you haven't been to see it, you really should go and see it. It's very inspiring, I think, and particularly when you consider that the collaborative effort for the team really changed what was going to happen on that site. It was going to be another example of where a hole in the ground was filled in and the community were to get a brand new park over the top. And the state of the ruin, no doubt, was very off-putting for some people, but I think we have here a work where the stabilisation of the ruin and the playful interpretation, the new elements, the way the space works, has really changed a community's idea about what sort of value could be gained from a park and why it's special to work with something that you've got instead of a clean slate and a new example. Boat Builders Yard, which I know we're going to hear about later as well, South Wharf. I put that up because, and I particularly like that you can see it in this shot, just the characteristic form of the maritime shed that you can see preserved, I think is very, very important. Of course, if you go in there, there's it's quite a modern contemporary intervention and lots changed, but I think we can see in the form of that building and the scale of that building in a precinct that's undergone so much change, how quite small-scale, meaningful gestures can remind us of our industrial past and give people a special connection with the place. And again, it's another one where there were all sorts of issues with dispensations from code requirements, but it was worth it for the end. For my last slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about opportunities, and that opportunities come in different form. The top one is a shot actually from Cockatoo Island, although it's not particularly, you can't particularly tell it's Cockatoo Island. But Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour is a very interesting site where there is a long and complex history with many layers. And it's a site where the spaces between the buildings and the remnants of things in the past are as important as the buildings themselves. So it's an example where the Conservation Management Plan, I think, very clearly set out the parameters for what was significant and accepting different types of significance over time and allowing a flexibility of use. And many of the exciting uses at Cockatoo Island are, in a sense, temporary uses. So like the lights and the people, they can be gone very quickly. We have temporary installations for the Sydney Biennale. There's camping areas and things like that. Of course, there's permanent changes as well, but I like the fact that Cockatoo Island has this ongoing use and flexibility, and that can work with a complex range of heritage values. We have, on the bottom left-hand side, River Studios, which we'll hear more about as well. And you can see at River Studios the idea of temporary placemaking. We've got here a collaboration between artists and designers, virtually an installation which can be taken away, but has given the building a use and has really, it's a low impact use, but it's had quite a strong creative output. And lastly, on that side, the School of Architecture and Design in Launceston in Tassie, again a collaboration between the school and the architects, and I think an example of quite a dramatic use of old and new, the old volumes in the 1950s railway workshop and the inserting new uses. But I think what a wonderful School of Architecture and Design to be in, to really understand that aspect of the past and embrace that with the new. So that's my quick overview of some of the issues. Many more issues, as Jim mentioned, and the other speakers will. I hope it's given you a bit of a taste for some of the issues and complexities. Of course, when I selected the case studies to put up, many of them could have gone in many categories. And I think it is important to also say we are talking about a range of heritage places and a range of heritage values. So there will be some places that require very careful conservation to protect their heritage values, and there will be some places that are more robust and can have more change in accommodating adaptive reuse. But I think a lot of those principles are the same for whatever place it is. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Helen. We're next going to hear from Ellie. Now, the way these panels are set up is that two of the speakers are going to speak in the first instance to a specific project, and two are speaking more generally, although in this case, actually, Angus might be being specific as well. But so Ellie's been asked to speak about Banbury, which is the reuse of the Olympic tyre sites. But in the discussion that follows, we expect to broaden from that. So go, Ellie. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me today. I should say this was one of this is a project that, as Helen said, she was heavily involved in, and Chris Jones, who's fellow director, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, was also, he was the director for the project, but I will try and explain it as best as I can. As you can see, a large tract of land with these are some historic shots of what the complex looked like, and obviously quite a lot of it had gone when our client Cedar Woods acquired the land. But of course there were some significant buildings, which are mainly the ones shown in the bottom slide. And just to come up, just to start the discussion on some of the issues, often, and we've done a number of redevelopments on what we might call brownfill sites, and when there's a heritage is always with an expert in heritage guiding the project. But often where, the context changes dramatically when we take the project on. And so once upon a time, this was industrial land, zoned industrial and whatnot. And then, of course, over time, and the zoning would have changed, the different overlays, the whole environment around these places changes, and it's our task as sort of architects to take what we have, and then adapting it to a different use. We also have to think about that use, that new use, and that brings up a whole host of other questions, scale, appropriateness of, the actual structures and the type of interiors that we're working with, the exteriors being, as I said, of a different scale. Also, they're often completely mismatched with what we're trying to deliver in the ultimate, in the brief. So, these are some of the buildings that were retained on the site. As you can see, if I can get the pointer to work. Does this pointer work? I'm not sure if it does. No. Anyway, on the diagram to the right, you can see the long building, which is that long rectangle in the middle of the two, sort of in the middle there, and that's this long building here that forms the central part of the complex that we were given to work with. The building on the right is the one that you can see in the bottom two slides, and then the one on the left was one whose footprint kind of disappeared in the actual redevelopment because of certain conditions I'll go in a minute, and the facade was retained. Here you see them in the conditions that those buildings were when we took on the project. The building up on the left-hand side at the top is the one that, and this one here, down here at the bottom here, is the one that only survived in facade, as a facade, basically. The issues being that it was in very poor structural condition, and correct me if I'm wrong, Helen, but because you know the project better than I do. We had very high floor-to-floor heights. As I said, the structural condition was poor. The structure itself was very, very, what would we call typical of industrial buildings, which is quite, fine, and it's okay for a pavilion type thing, which is just holding up a roof, but it's not fine for holding up floors and all the rest of it. So, and as Helen pointed out, and Justine as well, some of the BCAs and some of the regulations that have intervened in the many years that have passed between when this building was first built and what we've got now, there's a big gap there, and part of our role is to sort of navigate through it. We love industrial heritage, but we love all heritage partly because it's we like working with constraints, and some of these are a real challenge. We also think that it sort of in some ways makes our job easier, because the more constraints there are, the more sort of there is to work with something that's pre-existing. And the other thing that we love about heritage structures is that in some ways they also fulfil an environmentally sustainable kind of aspiration, where we're preserving not only for cultural reasons, but we're also preserving for material and conservation reasons, sustainability reasons. This is the building that I showed before in that diagram to the right, which was in fact the one that ended up being reused in terms of its structure, probably as fully as more fully than the others. But as you can see, part of the one of the issues that we have to deal with is that often there's been a gap between the decommissioning of the factory and the recommissioning or the buying of this bit of real estate by a client. And in the intervening time, there's the condition of the building often deteriorates, and sometimes it deteriorates to a point where it's beyond salvage. Fortunately, this wasn't the case. But as you can see, there was major damage internally to some of there was a fire that had been started up inside the complex. And even though the owners had done the best they could in security, providing security to the site, when you've got large tracts of real estate with very little surveillance from neighbours and whatever, which is usually the case with these sorts of things, things happen. Okay, so this is a rendering with like a bird's eye view of what we designed, and then some vignette sort of views of the renderings of how some of the spaces turned out. As you can see on the left-hand side at the top, the building, as that I was talking about, was kind of left as a facade, but the facade was used in such a way that it could provide some courtyard spaces for the residents. To the right, the interior, as you can see, it's pretty similar to the shot that Helen was showing before, which is really the restoration of that burnt-out interior to kind of fully restored to its past glory. And then, as you can see down the bottom, the scale is, the site was changed from industrial to residential, and there was a lot of subdivision that went on behind, and some townhouses and other things that were delivered, which weren't part of our work. But when you look at what we did, I mean, we just retained the industrial buildings, but really the kind of use makes it quite tricky to kind of change into a residential use. This is how it is today. This is, again, some of the interventions that we made to, and you can see some of that facade of the existing having to be reconstructed because of its structural damage that it suffered. You can see here where, the insert photo shows how it was, how we found it, and then how we kind of transformed it to turn this into a townhouse development. Further along on the same street, again, how it was, some of it was modified to a residential development. And again, just the facade of the building that was basically left intact, but of course changed from a showroom to, and this is the interior of that same building and how it looks today now that it's been fully restored. Sorry, should go back. That's it.
Kilmahew St Peter's. So, yes, this is an old religious institution built in 1966. St Peter's Seminary, where they used to train young priests. Let's describe it as built in the style of a lot of industrial architecture. It used a lot of free-floating concrete. You can begin to see it's already suddenly got interesting because this modernist pile has been dropped into a bucolic romantic setting. And that setting here on the west of Scotland, we're 20 miles west of Glasgow, industrial city in the west of Scotland. And it's part of an old Victorian estate. So if we go back to, let's go back to the 1860s. This place would have been owned by the Burns family, who probably owned some of the liners that some of your forebears arrived in Australia on amazing massive shipping company, Cunard. And he put together 8 bits of land to make this big estate. The estate's interesting because it's on 2 gorges. So if you imagine a V of gorges running down and a plinth in the middle, and right in the middle you can see a taller building there, and that was the Baronial House, which was built in 1866, so almost 100 years before the seminary. And you can see there that there's a sort of juxtaposition of 2 buildings. You've got the Baronial building, and then you've got this seminary building, which was literally smashed into the sides of the Baronial House. So the architects who built this did something very unusual, certainly in a UK context. I can't speak for Australia. But they decided to kind of collide 2 centuries together. So instead of pretending that our heritage just sort of nicely slots together, they decided to kind of attack the past. And I really like that idea of architecture as transgression. And let's face it, most of our cities are really messy. They're just different egos and different power bases exploding into each other. Occasionally you get areas that get a chance to breathe. But most cities are really just jumbles of sort of mad ideas and aspirations and needs. And here it is manifest on a small scale in the Scottish countryside. So it's a very, very provocative piece of architecture. And that provocation's an interesting starting point. This is 5 minutes, so I'm not going to, if any of you stay tonight, I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but this gives you the site. So the invite into this building comes through this natural setting. And I think that's very, very important. A lot of my narrative and a lot of the way I speak about things is to describe the exterior first, to describe where something is set. Too often in architecture it obsesses with the built form and it doesn't actually talk enough about its relationship to where it sits. And so it's very important that the invite, that the narrative for an audience coming into a new space understands their journey of how they get there, how they leave, what their expectations are and how they change depending on the surroundings. And in this case, what we're dealing with here is a hugely entropic setting, one where there has been an intense level of ruination over the last 40 years. So my starting point is that ruination, rather than being something to be overcome, is something to be embraced. A lot of the time we think of ruination as failure. It's the death of a previous ideology, or it's the closing down of a previous industrial life, or it's always about something that hasn't worked or has been superseded. But of course, ruination is in itself fascinating, because we even as human beings are in the process of being ruined. Our bodies are failing us. It depends on the age of the audience, but any of you who've hit 50 will know what I'm talking about. We are in the process of slowly decaying to the point of death, so I'm not going to get depressing here. And buildings are merely, external, non-organic forms of the same process. Time waits for no one. And this site is wonderful because it really encapsulates a very, very deep level of ruination. It's also, I won't stay with this, but it's an interesting site because it goes back to a 15th century castle keep. But it's a castle keep that's been deeply savaged by later owners who decided to turn it into a French Gothic folly. And these things don't really happen in Scotland. So this is like really early graffiti, architectural graffiti. It's someone going in and bastardizing the past because they wanted to turn it into something that reflected their romantic vision of the past. So instead of being this very tight little defensive structure, you can see they built these are now bricked in, but they built these amazing French Gothic windows and just punched them into the walls of this original Scottish castle. You don't do this sort of thing. So again, the site's interesting. It's already saying that humans are complex and they don't always play the games that we might define a kind of neat heritage story as revealing. But this is the seminary, And you can see in the top right-hand side, there's the relationship between the 20th century form, in this case quite a Frank Lloyd Wright-esque floating teaching block, next to the 19th century form of the castle keep. And then a main accommodation block and a moated structure that you walked inside to go inside. And the exterior, I mean, you can kind of see in the bottom right that it's kind of fairly classic of a kind of 1970s approach to car parks, to student accommodation. It's a ziggurat form from the exterior, and then in that kind of honeycomb it creates the cells that the seminarians, the young priests lived in. Over 4 years, as you got older, you were allowed to go higher up in the structure. So by your 3rd year, you were on the top floor, closer to God. Or maybe further away from the head priest, depending on which way you looked at it. But it was, and then you can see a really kind of Le Corbusier-esque structure in the bottom right of those 5 fingers holding the building. And the 5 fingers are the side chapels where a young priest would have to perform the rites of Mass with his back to the head priest. So you're learning in these side chapels facing away from the main Mass. A really amazing structure. So very playful, but a pretty brutalist form. And a building that was not loved. We describe this as a contested landscape, and I think that's quite interesting. I think it was touched on by Helen at the beginning, that the value of these sites is, it's not everybody's value. You know, people really hate this place. I could split it 50-50. A lot of local people, first thing they said is, I want to put a bomb under it. And then other people say, no, I've been in there with my children for the last 15 years. I love the graffiti. I love the feel of it. So, you know, humans are, it's really important not to categorize us as always looking for one solution, that there is one right way. One of the things that I find really turgid about most regeneration discussion of the last 20 years is it's sort of one solution that's economically driven, like the sort of one way to treat the past and remodel it. And I mean, I think this is what's been interesting about today, is it's beginning to show that there's lots of interesting ways to approach unvalued and undervalued sites. But in this case, I mean, you've got the attraction of 30 years of decay, which has brought artists from all over the world, actually, to come and make work there, to make films, to take photographs. And then you've got the straightforward desire to burn it down and just destroy it. So it's also attracted some really, the hard, nasty end of vandalism. So a place that's undervalued can work again in 2 ways. It can be inspiration for some people, and to other people, its desecration allows them to express the violence they feel in themselves. And it's a place that's deeply alienated. And the graffiti reflects either some very inspiring moments to the real nasty end of racism and sexism, and just that the way humans can manifest themselves in lost places. So again, it's not an easy picture. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting then, rather than to try and whitewash that and to try and create another perfect future for a building that's failed, that we would actually reflect that complex, lost, failed reality. And rather than try and heal the building by turning it back to its sort of perfect manifestation in the 1960s, I mean, interestingly, again, it didn't work, because Vatican II, for those of you who are from a Catholic background, Vatican II began to decree that priests should be sort of in their communities, and they certainly shouldn't be in these austere neo-medieval modernist settings hidden away in the countryside. So the building became actually redundant ideologically within 5 years of it having been built. So it's a very, very strange moment in time caught in the frame of this building. But this is it as you see it now, and really all you're left with is this skeletal frame. Everything else has been burnt out. And it's truly, I think it's truly one of the most destroyed places I've ever been in. It really feels like it's had the soul ripped out of it. So again, touching on some of the other themes, what do you do when you've got no money? How do you approach a building like this when you're from an impoverished arts organisation, when you have a huge amount of imagination, but you don't have access to establishment money in the instant way? And we watched various developers come and go and attempt to do standard regeneration models on this building, figuring around about, it would have been about, in Australian dollars, about 30 million spend. And the building defeated every attempt to do standard regeneration, which would have been the housing model led by developers. And there'd been other plans to do sort of standard housing in the wider estate and then consolidate the form. Again, it failed as a financial model. So we made a fundamental decision, which was to say, let's not attempt to save it, let's consolidate it in exactly the way that you would consolidate a castle from the 18th or 19th century. If any of you have visited Scotland, you'll see there's lots of castles from previous dynasties, from the clan wars and the different ways that Scotland was owned in the 16th to 18th century. So what you get is these remnant blocks of castles which have often been sort of left in a decayed form from the last battle that kind of destroyed them. And all that happens is that people will, in heritage terms, kind of build up the battlements a bit to stop them falling down, but they kind of accept that they've kind of that's what's happened to them. They're romanticized ruins. So how interesting to treat a 20th century building in the same way. We're now in the 21st century. The ideas that built this building, even though it's only 45 years ago, they're really gone. That post-war optimism is not of our time. These aren't optimistic days. Maybe they are in Australia. They're not where I come from. I think we live in the world feels more fragile. I think there's an understanding of the world just now, of the finiteness of certain things, of damage, the acknowledgement of damage that's been done in the past. It doesn't feel like we're living in vastly optimistic times, but within that realism is something perhaps more interesting, which is a certain perhaps humility or a humbleness about how we should design the future. So in our case, we decided, let's consolidate this wider form in the same way that you would treat an old castle, but just bring back one restored moment. And the restored moment is to restore the chapel at the heart of that wider complex. So you go through this brutalized, skeletal exterior and then just create one very simple form. And the interesting thing about this is that for everyone who hated it, and I spoke to quite a few priests who were there in the 60s, they described Mass with the sun passing south. And you can see these complex ziggurat roof lights that sit above the floating beams above the concrete altar. And as the sun moved round, it casts these geometric patterns across the floor of the space. And even those who hated living there, being in this sort of design machine, this classic modernist approach of this sort of machine for living, they described some diaphanous, some ephemeral moments where the building truly worked and it truly released something, an inner beauty within that brutality. It's kind of modernism at its best, within that stripped down soul that you do get in some industrial buildings. This is where the connection's very strong, that moment, the industrial cathedral, the sense of space, the sense of how light can move through it. And that sustained a little bit of belief in those who'd even hated the building. And so our feeling is to bring back this core heart, this little beating heart, within this broken frame. So it absolutely accepts you're not going to spend that 10, 15,000 million that you don't have. You just concentrate the money where it can have most effect and release its potential through that. So I won't say more. I mean, the delivery vehicle of what we're doing, the delivery of the Invisible College, is to use this as a multi-purpose space, and it'll have kind of free university and taking academics out of universities, out of these type of settings, to places where the sites themselves become the inspiration, and use the setting as the subject matter to inspire work, to inspire new thinking, and to get university academics and some of the great thinking that often happens in these kind of walls out and interlinked with local communities and interlinked with wider groups of people, and to value then the different ways that someone who's lived locally for 40 years might have something which is as much of interest to say as someone who has studied a specific knowledge area, a discipline within a university, and to bring those together on a horizontal basis. So sort of the kind of ideal of a free university. So I'm beginning to sound quite utopian, so I need to be a bit careful here. But I think I am probably a utopian deep down. That desire to kind of try and not remodel the world, accept that failure, accept loss, but re-put things together again in an interesting way for your time. And I think that reuse of 20th century heritage is really important, and really important to value keeping those frames and keeping those frameworks, because especially in a young country, a very old country, but a young country for many of the people who are sat in this room, it's your living heritage. This is your land. This is your landscape. This is the urban heritage is equally vital to the natural, in the sense of it's what you grow up with. It's what models your visual language. So it has a tremendous value, a deep value that sometimes isn't always understood, and sometimes it's rejected for a lack of thinking through the value it can bring. Sorry, I went over my 5 minutes.
Everyone did, that's
okay.
fine.
See you later.
Okay. So as always happens when you ask people to speak for a short amount of time, they become so interesting that you don't stop them when they go over. So we have less time than we would hope for discussion, but that's fine. One of the reasons we put this mix of people together, I guess, was that we wanted to at least hint at all the kind of different ways in which reuse might operate. So exactly as you say, there's no one right answer, but there are multiple ways of finding opportunity in our industrial and non-industrial heritage, and we wanted to try and spark some conversation about the difference. And so we thought it was very, I think often arts uses feel very sort of sympathetic to industrial heritage, as you say, but we also wanted to kind of open the discussion about other kinds of use too, and also that I suppose buildings which have high heritage value, as one might say, and buildings which really no one knows who did it, it's not on any heritage register, but it's kind of offers all sorts of opportunities. So we're trying to bring a kind of diversity to the panel. So given that we don't have much time, I might open pretty much straight away to the floor, and so have a kind of discussion amongst us all rather than a discussion here and then a discussion there. But I just want to start, would any of the panellists like to comment on some of the things that have been, you've seen, that each other has said, or does anyone have anything particular to say in relation to someone else? No?
Well, I would like to comment. I think seeing the seminary and talking about particularly later 20th century buildings, for me it brings up so many of the same issues. And I have to say, in fairness to Angus before he spoke, I wasn't sure how much of a crossover there would be with what we were focusing on, but I think it does really demonstrate that some of those qualities about placemaking, about community, about scale, about focus of a whole area, they go with industrial buildings, but I think they go with the sort of grand vision 20th century works, as well as the particular aesthetic qualities of the spaces that you were highlighting. So, I thought that was particularly interesting.
I'd like to, just seeing the other presentations, to me what they bring is the fact that maybe, as an architect, I'm always pushed towards, because, I have clients who who've bought this site and, they've got a limited amount of time that, where things need to be delivered. We're always pushed to a sort of a total solution of something, or a total reimagining of something. But what I think the project, the River Studios and St Peter's brought up, is the fact that there could be, and there should be, also room for projects that don't get the total solution, don't get the total, makeover. And I've been, we've been involved many times with projects which have fallen over because there wasn't the money, or the pressures on the site, like contamination and all sorts of other things, or just or whatever it was, were just too great for the site to be reopened for the enjoyment of the public. And that's such a, that's such a shame, such a missed opportunity. And how we work towards, getting some of these industrial or any other type of heritage to contribute to our cultural, to our lives, and not necessarily to what they might end up with in the future, but just to let them be what they are. In what form? So
one of the things we were very conscious of was the potential of temporary uses to kind of make some breathing space in buildings too. We really tried to find examples of projects where there was sort of low impact or temporary use that weren't arts based, and it was really hard, and I don't think we found anything. And so I think that to a degree, I think some of the activities that go on within arts and cultural organisations might also show a way for other kinds of uses which need not be intensive, which need not be expensive. So one of the things I think that we're very interested in is trying to find how the lessons learnt within creative environments might impact on other kinds of users, because there are other users who don't have much money either. It's not always, so what's one of the things, we haven't got an answer to that. But do we have some comment and question from the floor? Does anyone like to? Charity.
Does it seem that some of the problem might be about the restrictive practices of rezoning? Some of these, a lot of these sites get saved by virtue of being rezoned as residential, but then by being rezoned as residential really shuts down possibilities because it can put in amazing that we can have some kind of hybrid manufacturing / residential, which would allow some of these historical practices to be re-embedded in a new way in their site.
Yeah.
Boston has a fantastic kind of, I guess it's policy that the only type of residential use that can occur in sort of buffer zones between industry and residential spaces are artist live workspaces. So they create a residential capacity in an industrial zone, essentially, which is beyond caretaker, which is very interesting. We've tried to find ways to introduce that here, especially around certain mills and things that are situated in residential areas. But sorry?
I think that is a major problem, and just the rezoning, which brings the land value up and means that the developer needs to realise, a high level return in order to develop that site. It's a huge problem for us, and I think perhaps some of the later speakers might talk a little bit about that, but I think setting those parameters with major redevelopment from the start is necessary, or we lose that ability to develop things over time and to use those, less intensive uses that might be suitable on the site.
So I think the next session, hopefully, we will discuss some of that in the kind of urban context.
I'm really interested just in how you do argue then to a client in any of the different contexts we've heard from to do less. I mean, because in some ways,
Yeah.
not so much with the first project, but the others have argued, and the later comment, for desirability of an end product where you've done less architecturally, development-wise, everything, heritage-wise, whatever. I'm just wondering if anyone has a further comment in a sense of saying, well, what sort of strategy would actually persuade them?
Yeah. Well, look, there's a couple of obvious ones. One is it actually costs less money to keep what's there. And I think the Canberra Glassworks, the conversion from the powerhouse, are a real prime example where so much money went on the new stuff that there really wasn't any money to do anything with the old. So it had to just sort of stay and be patched up, and that's the basis of some jobs. But I think it's also where a strong statutory framework comes from. I think advising clients, really what you're advising them is on their level of risk. And if a place has heritage values that are well documented, either on a state register or on a local level with council, the risk to the client in not getting a permit for what they want to do is a very large risk for them to take. So, speaking personally, I often find it's quite helpful to really explain to them what those values are and where there might be offsets and opportunities, where there might be scope for more change and less change, in terms that they might respond to, which is about risk, because they don't want to go through the project and have it knocked back or have a key part of it knocked back. And, that's a different strategy from, I'm sure, the strategies that Letty would use. But I think these are real ways that you can argue for things.
There's a really fantastic model which I'd highly recommend anyone to go out and look up, which is the Emscher Landscape Park in the Ruhr in North Germany. I'm sure some of you will have come across it. There's well-known sites like Zollverein and Duisburg Nord. But I'm doing a work out there just now, and you've got industrial culture, it varies from World Heritage sites, which have multi-million pound state programs flooding in to sort of, and they're very high-end, sort of quite bourgeois sort of approaches. All of the industry has really gone from them. They're not, none of the rawness exists on those sites, but that's kind of appropriate. They're just incredibly beautiful industrial buildings. And then you have other sites like old coke works on a vast scale, where interestingly, ex-worker guilds, so it's interesting that it involves the people who used to work there, who really just loved those places, working together with local politicians and saying, okay, we haven't got money for it, but what we're going to do is put it into this state where we simply want you to allow people to walk through it because we think it's a fantastic place to visit. And they just create temporary walkways. They use, a little bit like you, they'll use very, very industrial motifs to create safe passageways, so you can go in a Bessemer converter or you can walk down and through the places which really, unless you were working there, you didn't have access to, and that's it. And there's a minimum amount until another use might be found, but that is enough in itself, because they are fascinating places to be in. So I think sometimes the solution can be very, very simple. Or in the case of others, and if you have a really, really big site, I think this was touched on, and where there's a complex range of heritage values, is to absolutely accept that there can be multiple outputs for different funders simultaneously. And then that's about really clever project management, where you have to protect the aesthetic value of what's been created, And often it is a question of kind of protecting that despite the outputs, despite the planning laws, despite the mitigations, despite the commercial pressures, and kind of protect the soul of the place while actually delivering the rather harder, more mechanistic outputs, instrumental outputs that are required by the different funders. And that's a tremendous set of skills required. That requires real sensitivity from a production, the core production team, to sort of balance those things up. That's where common experience like these sort of days are really important, to start sharing that common practice, because it can really only be done by experience on the ground and finding your ways round planning laws and those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's it's almost too late. Once something has been rezoned and then sold, it's almost too late to kind of hope that some of it will be set aside, because, well, number one, the pressure for people selling on is also that they need to clean up as much of the site as possible, because the more they leave on the site which is perceived as a risk, whether it's contamination or it's an old building or it's the more of a negative value in effect the site has. And so then we're dealing with the reactionary sort of approaches. There almost needs to be and this is, I don't know how this happens or what mechanism we could use to make it happen, but if it's a government held property, well, that's not so. Perhaps it's more possible. When it's an industrial estate that has been sold on, I don't, whether there's some sort of mechanisms, some sort of incentives for keep holding back some of the more problematic things that could be then left to have their own sort of quiet life again. And one of the things that I think is missing from a lot of developments, and this is including the things that we do, is that there never seems to be enough time for something spontaneous to happen on sites. It's sold. The site is just left to whatever, it's fenced and then left to, the vagaries of time and ravages of whatever's going on, and then it's developed. There's no students moving in to sort of do something or some other, gradual sort of love or gradual repossession of these things that kind of start to suggest a natural or a natural evolution of parts of it, at least. The first thing that happens is demolition, and then the demolition, that's it. And then you're left with a vacant lot with some walls around it or no walls, and then someone just buys it, subdivides it, and just sticks on something. And there's no, in between, in other words. I'd like to see more in between.
We're going to have a question from Flavia, and then I think we'll have a bit of a leg shake and the next panel where hopefully some of this discussion can continue. So Flavia.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, one example of that happening that you said doesn't happen is a Newport substation.
Yeah.
Where actually the community itself revitalised, and it's not perfect. But the point that I wanted to make, and I think it's a bit in response to Justine's question, how do we have different ideas of reusing this stuff without the usual artist studios? And one way is actually to run design studios. I've been running adaptive design studios since 2009, and I find that giving students a building or giving students something to work with and say, what can you put in here? You get the ideas across. And just working in Newport for the last couple of years, we found that by giving students a brief for what do you think the ideas of the building, they can actually make 3D images and put that out into the community, and that creates a lot of awareness of the potential. So I think maybe one way forward is to really work more on that and get more students involved, because they have great ideas about how adaptive reuse can go forward, and they're the
Well, I think that might be a very good place to switch panels. So please join me in thanking our panellists for a